Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
The Missing Magnolias podcast tells the stories of the missing and murdered.
Ultimately, these kids went into state custody and they never came out.
Together with missing persons expert Dr. Michelle Janice, we uncover the real true crime experience.
Every time we do another interview, I'm like, how do we find so many badass women?
We hear from victims who turn their pain into something positive.
We didn't find out till we were 11 or 12 years old that our mom was murdered.
In Times Square, it said Mickey Shunick fought for her life.
And experts who think outside the box to solve cases.
I scour missing persons databases like NamUs to see if they're uploaded to that database.
Subscribe to Missing Magnolias on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts today.
Hey, this is a true crime show where I have a tendency to drop trashy language at times. And I do cover murder and other acts of violent crimes. Sometimes they're even sexual in nature. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors! Welcome to Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ. I'm your holly jolly host who dons gay apparel, CJ. Find me on the socials as Rainbow Crimes just about everywhere, and Beyond the Rainbow on Facebook. Are you all ready for the holidays? I think I am. Although I am very worried about my little dog Nilla. It's been a while that I've been really worried about her. She's getting very bony, you know, when animals or people age and they get bony. And she was super lethargic for several days. She always snarls at my daughter and her boyfriend's big dogs, but she wasn't. She could barely sit up or stand on her own. This past week, she's been a little more alert, and she's snarling again at the big dogs, thank goodness. And she's able to walk some to go potty. I hardly slept at all the other day. I just kept thinking, this is it. I'm going to have to put her down. And as selfish as it sounds, I just can't yet. And then when I see her doing a bit better, I hold on to hope. She doesn't seem to be in any pain, which is great. So if you all wouldn't mind sending out some good jujus into the universe for her, I'd sure appreciate it. The more the better. Thank you. Again, her name is Nilla, like the wafer. And I gotta tell you, I might not be happy about it, but this month seems to be turning into a month of covering serial killers. Yay, my faves, said me never. Also, my release dates are totally out of whack this month, and I apologize for that. I hope to get back on track at the start of the new year. So as I said, I have another serial killer case, but this one is from Australia, where a psychotic serial killer, or killers, took the lives of at least 5 young men. Now, before I start, I do want to tell you that these murders are partially solved, which means they're in part unsolved also. There's some similarities to the past serial killer I just did, Randy Kraft. This killer or killers were active in the 70s and they ended in 1983. Only this killer or killers didn't start as early as Randy. He or they didn't start until 1979. You might have noticed that the title of this episode is The Family Murders, and I keep alluding to there being a killer or killers. And that's because the Adelaide, Australia police felt that it was more than one killer. And I kind of agree with that. They also wanted to capture the happy family of perpetrators who worked as a team to carry out abductions, rapes, torture, and murders of these young men. At least that's what one detective who was interviewed on the news show 60 Minutes had said. And that's how the name Family Murders came about. Kind of gives you the Manson family vibes, right? It also gives off Jeffrey Epstein feels a little bit for some reason. But that reason might become a little clearer as I continue on with the story. There's only been one man arrested for these crimes. He would have been considered the big boss of all of them. But at least 12 people have been suspected, including higher-profile Australians, perhaps government officials or celebrities. And I think that's what gave off the Jeffrey Epstein vibes for me. Now, stay with me here. the one man who was actually convicted of one murder out of the 5 I mentioned way back when I covered the case of the gay professor from Adelaide named George Duncan. George was allegedly thrown from a bridge to his death by the police. It was George Duncan's murder that made for some stricter laws in Australia to protect the LGBTQ from hate crimes. The man I mentioned in that George Duncan episode, who plays a heavy role in this episode, was a young Bevan Spencer Von Einem. In the George Duncan episode, Bevan was instrumental in saving the life of a gay man who was tossed from a bridge into a river below. He helped pull the man from the water and drove him to the hospital. And while he might have been a hero then, in this episode, Bevan was the only man convicted of the family murders. But he's also believed to be the mastermind behind the whole family operation. Police also think that Bevan had 2 or possibly 3 lieutenants. One was a businessman, one was a doctor, one was a former male sex worker. And as I said, Bevan was only convicted of one of the murders. And that's why this is considered a partial cold case due to the other 4 victims and no resolution or justice for them. And although it's been said there's a dozen people in this family, I found a list of at least 16 potential members, possibly more. Several were trans women. A couple of them were men who dressed in drag. And the rest, I assume, because they had male partners, were gay men. So let's dig in and start by learning what we can from the 5 victims, and then we'll talk about some of the family members. The first known victim was 17-year-old Alan Arthur Barnes. Alan was described by his mother as being a quick wit, if not a bit cheeky. He used his sarcasm as a means of humor. As he was towards the end of his teen years, Alan was trying to discover exactly who he was. This meant doing what a number of teens do, experimenting with weed and alcohol. He even pushed himself to try new things that might have been out of his comfort zone. This may have even included same-sex encounters. On Monday, June 18, 1979, Alan was reported to authorities as missing by his mom. This was after he didn't return back to his home from the home of a friend that he had recently made. The new friend was named Darko, and he lived in the town of Cheltenham. Alan had left his home for Darko's on Saturday, the 16th of June. The following day, Sunday, Alan and Darko were going to hitchhike to Alan's home in Salisbury. Darko's brother dropped the young men off at the bus station, but Darko soon returned home after the two weren't having any luck getting a ride. Darko didn't appear too concerned for Alan's safety because it was broad daylight. Alan was last seen getting into a white sedan with at least 3 other people in it. And the only reason we know that is because a witness would come forward later with that information. Alan's body would be discovered nearly a week later on June 24th under the South Para Bridge near Williamstown. 2 women hikers were out enjoying the day and getting some exercise at the South Para Reservoir, and they're the ones that found his body. It appeared that his killer or killers had tried to throw him from the South Para Bridge and into the water, but Alan's body missed the water, landing on the dirt below. When his autopsy came back, it showed Alan had been deceased less than 48 hours, which means that his kidnappers kept him for a while before killing him and then disposing of his body. And although Alan's body appeared to have suffered some tremendous torture, his body had been washed and redressed in clothing that didn't belong to him. It was most likely to get rid of any evidence. The autopsy also showed that Alan had died of severe bleeding from his anal region. This was thought to have been the result of a large blunt object being thrusted up in there. His toxicology report also showed drugs and alcohol in his system. Alan had worked several days a week refilling vending machines. Interestingly enough, one of the places he did the restocking was a business where Bevan Von Einem worked as an accountant. This could possibly mean Alan recognized Bevan the day he got into the car with him and disappeared. 2 days later, an anonymous crime tip came into the police station. It named Bevan Spencer Von Einem as Alan's killer. Bevan's name was added to the suspect list, but it seemed like the police were not in a huge hurry to question Bevan. 25-year-old Neil Muir lived a transient lifestyle. He moved from place to place, and he had demons in the form of alcohol and drug addiction. There was speculation he was involved in sex work to pay for his habits, but he also had to pay for a room to stay in and his food. So I believe this still falls under the category of survival sex. Neil had tattoos, long hair, and a scruffy look, almost like an 80s rock star. He was last seen August 27, 1979, as a bouncer had booted Neil's inebriated ass out of a bar. Neil stumbled down the street, appearing to be wandering aimlessly. The following day, Tuesday, August 28th, fishermen found several black trash bags floating in low tide of the Port Adelaide River. Inside the bags were the remains of Neil. An autopsy of Neil's remains showed that he had suffered the same anal injuries Alan had succumbed to. Also, his penis had been cut and a testicle removed. As well, most of his internal organs had been taken out. Police figured by the killer or killers dismembering Neil's body, it was a much easier way for them to discard of the remains. But why Neil's internal organs were removed too, nobody really knew. Police also felt that the killer or killers were hoping the tide at the port would come in and take the bags out to sea, but that never happened. And although Neil's body had suffered the same anal injuries as Alan's, police were not tying the two murders together. Not too long after Neil's remains were discovered, Bevan was brought in for questioning about Alan's murder. So now it's been nearly 3 months and they bring him in to question him about Alan. After answering some of the questions, Bevan asked about Neil. Now the police didn't even bring Neil up because they had no idea the two cases were related. So for Bevan to mention Neil, you know the police were all, "Dude, really? What do you know about this Neil fella?" Bevan said he was just wondering because he and Neil were once lovers. Police thought it odd that Bevan somehow was tied to both these murders. Although both of the murders were gruesome, police had another lead on Neil's case. It would seem Neil was also involved with the Dr. Peter Millhouse, and this doctor might know something about his murder. More on the doctor later. 14-year-old Peter Stogneff lived with his family in the suburb of Adelaide. He had a day off from school on August 27th of 1981. Well, Peter didn't really have the day off. It was unscheduled, as he planned to ditch school that day and meet his cousin at the mall. He put on his backpack and he left as if he were going to school. He didn't, though. He didn't want his folks to find out that he was ditching school. So that day, Peter headed off to the local mall that he often hung out on weekends with his friends. A little bit later, he returned home after he knew that his folks were at work. He dropped his backpack in the garage, and then he set out again to meet one of his friends at a different mall. But Peter would never arrive to meet his friend. When Peter's parents came home, they discovered Peter's backpack hidden in the garage, and they started the phone tree calls to his friends. With zero luck, they worriedly called the police and reported Peter missing. Peter remained missing for nearly a year. Then, in May of 1982, a farmer started to clear out his land of brush. First, he used a bulldozer, and then he burned it. Not the bulldozer, the brush. This happened about 50 kilometers or 31 miles away from Adelaide. The fire burned steady for 2 days. Then the farmer returned to his land on the 22nd of June to inspect the land. Upon inspection, he came across a human skull, and he immediately contacted the police. The remains were examined and determined to be that of Peter. Police put as much information out to the public that they could, and some tips came in, including one with a sighting of Peter leaving the first mall he went to with a man. Problem is that the man could never be identified, although it is believed that the man was a friend of Bevan's. And I'm not 100% sure of this, but the friend, he was either a cross-dresser or in the process of becoming a trans woman, and maybe he hadn't transitioned fully yet, but his name is Noel Brooke. Noel matched the description of the person Peter had been seen with, and he lived in the same neighborhood as Peter. To this day, Peter's murder has never been resolved, though police feel it's related to the family murders. 18-year-old Mark Langley attended a party in Windsor Garden on February 27, 1982. He was seen leaving a birthday party with a young man and a woman. This couple were friends of his. They drove to War Memorial Drive, where apparently Mark got into a small verbalization with the young man, and he left the couple to go clear his head. The couple drove off for a while. They too needed to clear their heads, I guess. And when the couple came back a little bit later to get Mark, he was nowhere to be found. The next day, Mark's worried parents called the police to report him missing. 9 days later, Mark's body was found in the foothills. It had started to decompose due to February being a summer month in Australia. His cause of death was excessive bleeding from his anus. He too had a blunt object stuffed into his anal region. Police determined, like the other victims found, Mark was murdered elsewhere and moved after his death. But something a little different the coroner saw in Mark was a precision surgical scar just above Mark's penis. It had even been shaved there at the point of the surgery. The wound had surgical tape and staples in it. Now, the theory behind this was that the object shoved into Mark's anus got stuck inside him, and it somehow wrapped up in his intestines. So in order to remove it, it had to be done surgically. A toxicology report came back and showed that Mark did have drugs in his system. 15-year-old Richard Kelvin is the last known victim of the family murders. Richard was the son of Rob Kelvin, an Australian newsreader. A newsreader is what us Americans call a news anchor. Richard would disappear less than 400 meters or 1,300 feet from his home on June 5, 1983. Richard was down the street at a neighborhood park kicking around a soccer ball with his dad Rob and his friend Boris. Rob, the dad, decided he wanted to walk home, and he left the boys at the park to continue playing. A little later, it was time for Richard's friend Boris to head home. So Richard walked his friend to the closest bus stop, and then he started to walk the less than 400 meters home when he was approached by someone. Witnesses to Richard's abduction heard raised voices coming from the area in which Richard was taken, and then a noisy car sped off. There unfortunately were no visual witnesses, but the audio witnesses also said it sounded like several people, not just Richard. Therefore, it's believed Richard was taken by more than one person. When Rob reported his son missing, police treated Richard as a runaway, which honestly, I'm surprised they didn't do that for 14-year-old Peter as well. Richard's family wholeheartedly disputed the fact that Richard ran away. After all, Richard was a happy kid, and he had just landed a serious girlfriend in high school. There was absolutely no reason for him to be a runaway. 2 days later, the police pulled their thumbs out of their ass and they went door to door canvassing the area. They were asking residents about missing Richard. The information and the audio witnesses coming forward brought a black cloud over the investigation, and it definitely closed the door on the runaway theory. Now, I know you guys listen to true crime. You're here. So we all know that 48 hours is the most crucial time to find a missing person. Had the police started immediately and not argued that Richard was a runaway, they might have been able to retrieve Richard quicker and unharmed. In the weeks that followed Richard's abduction, tips kept being called into the police station. One of the tips identified 2 men as having kidnapped Richard. The caller told police the men were driving around in an older white sedan, and that description sounded very much like the same car involved in the abduction of Alan Barnes. A month and a half later, on July 24, 1983, a family was out gathering moss rocks near an airstrip in Kersbrook. The family stumbled upon the deceased body of Richard Kelvin. Richard had been washed and redressed. Although it appeared that Richard wasn't cleaned up quite as well as the first victim, Alan, there was still some evidence left on Richard. Richard's cause of death was determined to be blood loss from an anal injury, and his toxicology report came back showing alcohol and sedatives in his bloodstream. Okay, taking you away from the victims for just a moment, let's talk about our main suspect. Bevan Spencer Von Einem was born May 29, 1946, a Gemini. Not a whole lot is known about Bevan's childhood or adolescence. Most of what we know about him started the night he saved the gay man tossed over the bridge by the police in 1972. Bevan would have been 26 years old at that time. When the family murders began, Bevan would have been in his early 30s, and by the time they ended, he would have been in his middle to late 30s. Author Debbie Marshall shined a tiny light on Bevan's childhood. She said he's of German descent, and the home he grew up in was termite infested. He had a terrible father who allowed a drinking buddy to rape Bevan as a boy. But Debbie also stated in her book, Banquet, The Untold Story of the Family Murders, Bevan lived in a fantasy world in his head. In his mind, he came from a family lineage of prominent Germanic figures dating back to the Crusades. He sees himself as a valued professional, perhaps an airline pilot or a doctor. And in his mind, he is sexually attractive to almost all males. He's not a boring old gay, but someone men would fight to be with. He sounds fucking delusional to me. Now let's go back to the evidence found on the last known victim, Richard. There were 5 different sedative, hypnotic type drugs in Richard's bloodstream: Mandrax, Noctec, Amytal, Valium, and Rohypnol. Mandrax was a drug controlled and regulated by the Central Board of Health. This allowed police to sift through all the prescriptions for that drug. The one prescription that really caught their eye was written for, now get this, I'm sure you're going to be shocked, B. Von Einem. Police realized this was the same guy who they had brought in for questioning several years prior for Alan Barnes' murder, and then out of the blue he mentioned Neil Muir. Both of those young men had died from something thrusted into their anal region, the same as Richard had. Both Alan and Neil had the same drug in their system. But linking Bevan to the murders of Alan and Neil proved to be much more difficult than the police had hoped. Bevan was again brought in to be questioned for Richard's murder. Although Bevan claimed he was in bed with the flu when Richard was murdered. He also told the police he hadn't seen Richard and didn't know what happened to him, or where he might be. While the questioning was going on, Bevan's home was being searched. Police found a bottle of Mandrax, which Bevan admitted were his to help him sleep. They asked him if he had any other drugs in the home, and Bevan said no. But police found a bottle of Noctec hidden on a ledge behind his dresser. Bevan nervously told the police he forgot about those as he rarely uses them. Police had no choice but to release Bevan. But before they did, Bevan agreed to allow the police to take a hair sample and a blood sample. Still, things were not sitting well with detectives about Bevan, and they worked to build a case while Bevan went on vacation to the UK and Russia in August. He didn't return home till September of 1983. While Bevan was frolicking in other countries, the case against him was growing. Fibers found on the clothing Richard's body was found in matched fibers in Bevan's home. and hairs found on Richard matched Bevan's. Police searched the city to find the informant they called Mr. B, who left them the tip about Bevan murdering Alan, the first supposed victim. They finally found him. Mr. B told the police how Bevan enjoyed picking up young male hitchhikers. He'd make them drink alcoholic drinks laced with hypnotic drugs. Mr. B also told him how Bevan would sexually abuse the victims for one night and then release them. But Mr. B was adamant he was not involved in, nor did he ever participate in any murder. Mr. B also talked about some of Bevan's associates. When the associates were questioned, they had very little to say. However, by February 20th, 1984, law enforcement had enough evidence against Bevan to have him arrested and put on trial. But all the evidence was just for Richard. Now faced with rock-solid evidence, Bevan began to change his story to fit a narrative that matched the evidence against him. Bevan said he was out on June 5th looking for a parking spot to get some fish and chips, and he nearly ran over Richard. The two got talking, and Richard gave Bevan the impression that he might be bisexual, but he hadn't really explored it. See, this is Bevan's way of doing a bit of victim blaming. Bevan said Richard started to talk about how he was being bullied at school. So Bevan invited him to his home, and Richard willingly got into Bevan's car. That's undoubtedly how the fibers got onto Richard. He also had put his arm around Richard to console him when Richard was upset. And he's positive that's how his hair got on Richard. Bevan concluded his news story with Richard staying for a couple hours, and then Bevan dropped him off at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and then he gave Richard $20 for a taxi ride home. But you see, there were a couple of flaws in Bevan's news story. One, that meant he had lied initially to police when he told them he was in bed with the flu. And the other rather large flaw was that the amount of fibers on Richard's clothes were far too many for the young man to have only been at Bevan's home for 2 hours. At his trial, Bevan, of course, pleaded not guilty. With all the physical evidence and circumstantial evidence against him, the jury found Bevan guilty of murdering Richard Kelvin. He was automatically sentenced to life at Yatala Labor Prison. But unfortunately, that was the only murder law enforcement had enough to tie Bevan to. Before I close out this episode, I'd like to talk a little about some of the other alleged members of the family murders. Let's start with Dr. Peter Milhouse, who I said I'd get back to later. He is suspected of being the one who performed the surgery on victim Neil Muir, the one who dismembered him and had his internal organs removed after Neil died from the anal injury. Dr. Milhouse was arrested and charged, but then he was acquitted during trial. Dr. Milhouse died in a New South Wales retirement home in 2015. Another doctor who was thought to be part of the family was Dr. Stephen Woodards. He was a physiotherapist, which is pretty close to a physical therapist from what I gather. Police suspected Dr. Woodards as to having helped committed the murders with Bevan. Dr. Woodards was also known as Dr. Steve. He'd go to pubs, drug young men he thought attractive, and then he'd escort the drunk man back to his home under the premise that he was helping the man. Sure you are, Dr. Steve. You weren't helping the man, you were helping yourself to the man. In 2011, he was charged with 5 counts of raping teenage boys under 17. The charges were dropped, though, because it couldn't be proven that the boys were under 17 at the time. Dr. Steve is also believed to be the one who supplied Bevan with the drug Mandrax. Magistrate Richard Brown, who was in a relationship with Dr. Steve at the time, was suspected of being part of the family also. Along with his lover, Dr. Steve, he too was charged with drugging young men and raping them. His charges were also dropped. Magistrate Brown was often referred to as a high-profile attorney. Mr. B, the one who dropped dime on Bevan to the police, is suspected of being one of Bevan's lieutenants. He was a former sex worker and 10 years younger than Bevan. Police feel Mr. B knew far too many details of the murders to not be part of them. Mr. B admitted to picking up hitchhikers with Bevan, drugging them, and even raping them, but not to murdering them. Mr. R was supposedly another of Bevan's lieutenants. He was a businessman. He's believed to be behind many, if not all, of the murders along with Bevan. He's also thought to have been one of the main participants in the drugging and raping of many young men. Prue Furman, Sarah Novak, Megan Collier, and Carrie W. They were 4 trans women that lived together who Bevan was very close with. Often when Bevan and one of his cronies, including the trans women, would pick up a young man, a beer would be handed to the victim, much of the time laced with a drug. And Bevan would tell the young man they were going to the woman's house to get laid. The young man willingly went, and once there, one of the older trans women would take the young man back into a bedroom, where the young man would be sodomized by the trans woman who hadn't completely transitioned yet. The young man would then be released after being raped. You may wonder why none of these young men reported their attacks. Well, many did. Sometimes the perpetrator of the crime would even be arrested for it. But nothing ever came of it, as there was never enough evidence. Mostly the trans women were used by Bevan as a lure to snag young men. Dennis St. Dennis was one of Bevan's oldest and dearest friends from childhood. Dennis ran a hair salon. He too was in on the kidnapping and raping of young men in Adelaide. Bevan would often take pictures of the young men that they had their way with, and then he'd take the pictures to the salon to share with Dennis. Together, these 2 men would go into a back room, spread the pictures out, and giggle at their victims. Dennis died in 2002. A gay man named Trevor Peters was friends with Dennis St. Dennis. Trevor would hear about Dennis's escapades with Bevan, and then he would go home with the knowledge that he gained and write into diaries about them. When Trevor died in late 2014, his diaries were found by his brother and turned over to the police. The information inside these diaries included it being him who witnessed Dennis and Bevan looking at photos of young men posed in various sexual positions, some even post-mortem, and then the 2 men giggling over them. Trevor was also close friends with 2 of the trans women of the family, and he documented conversations about their involvement with Bevan in the diaries. As well, there seemed to be enough detailed information about the first victim, Alan Barnes, to take Bevan to trial for Alan's murder. It even had information about the guys that helped Bevan kill Alan. But sadly, nothing ever came of the diaries' inputs, and nobody else was ever sentenced to time for these crimes. There's probably another 2 handfuls of participants or just folks with knowledge of these murders, and they too were considered part of the family. But I touched upon who I felt were the most important to the story. To this day, the family murders remains an open case. And to be honest, with this many people involved, I am just floored that more haven't turned on each other. And had Trevor not died, his diaries might still be under wraps. Not that they did much good in finding justice for the other 4 victims murdered. Death has claimed quite a few of these family members already, but many are still alive and living amongst us. Now I want to go back a little bit with a side story that could be important to the Alan Barnes murder. Remember Alan was with his new friend Darko? And Darko went home just minutes before Alan was abducted? There are rumors that Darko is the godson of a pedophile named Gino Gambardella. Gino was also acquainted with Bevan. It's believed Darko was the lure for Alan being abducted and murdered. The foundation this is set upon was from another boy Darko had befriended and introduced to Gino and some other man. The 4 went to a house and had sex together. It was non-consensual, of course, for the boy, a victim. That victim was released and then went to authorities, who, of course, couldn't prove it. And honestly, I don't believe the law enforcement of this time period really gave a rat's ass about gays. Hell, they were even killing gay men off themselves. Bevan is still incarcerated, but somehow was able to acquire child pornography in his prison cell. And even though they operated in different countries, both Bevan and Randy Kraft seem to have similar ways of operating. Both liked teen boys and young men. Both offered their victims alcohol laced with drugs. Both raped and sexually tortured their victims. And both were murderers. I don't know why I chose to cover this case so quickly after finishing up Randy Kraft. I guess I'm a glutton for punishment and want to punish you guys too. But maybe it's more like I stumbled upon this case a while back, and there just seemed to be so many levels and people involved it was kind of intriguing. Bevan, who is also a sick fuck, really should have been given the death penalty and had it carried out, unlike Randy Kraft, who was given the death penalty and just sits there on death row. The death penalty in Australia was abolished in 1973. And personally, I think we need to bring back the good old-fashioned stonings for predators like these. Rest in power to Alan, Neil, Peter, Mark, and Richard. And to all the surviving victims of the family murders. Hang tough, my friends. Well, Rainbow Warriors, that was a little longer than I thought. That's what she said. There will not be a true crime quickie this episode. I hope you all have a tremendous Christmas, Hanukkah, and Kwanzaa. Love you guys. You matter. And remember, it's not a crime to be gay, unless you're a murderer. And I'll be back in your ears for the new year.